Um, John, you're muted. Okay. You can
Technical issue. Lovely technical issue. Always starts with a technical issue.
go ahead.
All right, everybody, we are here joined today with Dr. Avi Loeb, who was recently named by the White House as the director of the new UAP Science Advisory Board. Dr. Loeb, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Or perhaps I should say welcome me because we're on your channel this time.
Well, science is independent of location. That's the beautiful thing that, no atom can violate the laws of physics. That's why we don't have a court system in the universe. There are the laws of everyone obeys the laws of physics.
We have no choice, but the laws of physics are the same here as on my normal channel. All right, Dr. Loeb, we are going to take audience questions today. So everybody feel free to ask whatever you want. I will see it and I will ask Dr. Loeb and then we'll have our answer. All right, Dr. Loeb, this asked by Callan 2K, what will be your guiding principles, rules, and morals in this project?
Yeah, so my leadership style is all about honesty and sharing what I know with the constituency that I represent, with the public and the scientific community. And this brings trust. And that's why I served for 3 terms of 3 years as chair of the astronomy department at Harvard, the longest serving chair. Everyone working with me could trust me. And so I hope to bring the same spirit to the deliberations of this new UAP Science Advisory Council. And all the data that we will study is unclassified, and therefore we could share our conclusions, our analysis, our recommendations with the public. There will be no classified data brought to our attention, and that's a great blessing because scientific work is founded on transparency and the sharing of information. Everyone should be able to understand what we are talking about if we explain it well enough. And so my hope is that we will be able to promote a resolution to the mystery of UAPs, unidentified anomalous phenomena. At the moment, their nature is unclear. Just a week ago, there was the 3rd batch of released files, and in it, there was a report from the director of the All Domain Anomaly Resolution Office, Dr. John Kozlowski, in which he mentions an event that lasted 2 days in October 2023, where very serious people, law enforcement officials, noticed objects that they cannot fully explain. And after analysis of their report, AERO decided that 40% of the phenomena reported cannot be explained by the technologies we're familiar with, either in the US or in adversarial nations. So this is very puzzling. And how often do you see a government official admitting that they're not doing their job? I mean, we pay of order $1 trillion for the defense budget of 2026, and yet there are objects in the sky that we cannot figure out. So what is unusual about this report is it could have been submitted as a classified memo to Pete Hegseth. If there was a serious suspicion that these orbs that give birth to smaller orbs in some cases might be drones produced by an adversarial nation. But instead, this report was made public. And on the same week, I was asked to lead this council with a group of scientists that I assembled. So, that to me implies that, first of all, the government is happy to cooperate, to collaborate with scientists. That's very different from the spirit illustrated in Steven Spielberg's movie that was released on the same day of this batch, the 12th of June, where a car is being smashed against a running train, as if scientists are the enemy of the government. That's not true in reality, okay? So we are partnering, we will do our best. We feel honored to serve the US government and help it resolve the nature of UAPs, and at the same time bring clarity to this subject that will be shared with the public. And this is great news. So that's my hope in terms of the outcome. And of course, reality could be far more inspiring than Disclosure Day that Steven Spielberg imagined. After all, he was imagining things just to, provide red meat to the audience. That's what artistic freedom allows you to do. But in my case, the task is to figure out reality. This is not something we imagine, but rather something real. And we can, it's like a detective story. We can figure it out with enough clues.
Now, Dr. Loeb, come on, Neil asks, and this is a very relevant question because I guarantee everybody's asking this one. If you discover aliens in the investigation, will you tell us?
Of course.
And who would you report to first? And would
Well,
it depend on, would it depend on them to allow disclosure, which I would assume would be the U.S. president?
Right. Well, as I mentioned, our consul will only deal with unclassified information. So we will analyze it. We will recommend better techniques to get to the bottom of this mystery. And that means recommending sensors, AI algorithms for analyzing the data, or we might do analysis that already gives us some hints about the nature of the object. And, that's the way science is done. It's a learning experience. It takes time. And at the end, if we end up concluding that we observed something that is definitely not human-made, I think that information should be shared with the public. There is no reason to hide it because we are all in the same boat. And just imagine, it's very analogous to a family living at home and thinking, having no clue whether they have neighbors down the street. And then you go out to the backyard and you notice a tennis ball that was thrown by a neighbor. And then the question is, are you supposed to hide this fact from your family members that are gathered at the dinner table? My answer is no, because one day this neighbor will show up at the front door. And so it's better to adapt to the reality, whatever it means. And the Vatican made a big mistake when it put Galileo Galilei in house arrest. It wanted to suppress the message that the Earth is not at the center of the universe. But in fact, the Earth was moving around the sun 4.5 billion times before the Vatican even existed. So the fact that it was popular within the Vatican to assume that the sun moves around the Earth did not change the fact, that the Earth moves around the sun. So 350 years after Galileo died, they admitted in 1992 that he was right because they had no choice. There was so much data, for example, from spacecraft looking at the Earth moving around the sun. I mean, it would have been foolish for them to continue to insist on the other view. So the way that science arrives eventually at the truth is by collecting enough data so that it would be foolish for anyone to argue otherwise. And we need to get to that point with respect to UAP. Now, I don't know as of now what their nature is. It's still possible that they are human-made. We haven't seen evidence beyond any doubt, and that's why many people are still in doubt. But by collecting more evidence, we can either, at the very least, if you have a down-to-earth view, at the very least, we will help national security if these are human-made objects, because we are helping the Pentagon fulfill its mission. But this is the minimum expectation. And if we find evidence for non-human made technology, obviously everyone on Earth should be aware of that.
Now, what sort of data sets are you going to you have access to? In other words, it was floated by one of the previous directors of Aero to set up instrument packages on, assets, military assets and things like that, air bases and perhaps aircraft carriers, things like that. Is there any possibility of that here, getting those data sets for your analysis?
Yeah, of course, that's very relevant. I mean, that's in the spirit also of the Galileo project that I'm leading. We built 3 observatories with an advanced set of sensors. We are now analyzing data on millions of objects, and we do triangulation to figure out their distance, velocity, and acceleration. And the same can be done, of course, by Aero, and they have a parallel program. So, indeed, we can encourage them to collect data of particular types. We can guide them as to how to get the missing data that we need in order to figure out the nature of these objects. And at the end of the day, it's a collaborative process. Even if they have access to classified information that we don't, we can basically guide them as to how to figure out what is going on. Now, of course, there are lots of theories about what the government has, and some testimonies in front of Congress argue that they have materials and even biologics from crash sites. I haven't seen any of that, and if there is such evidence beyond any doubt, that would resolve the issue very quickly. But I haven't seen it as of now, so I don't know what to make of it. It's still possible that we're dealing with retrieval and reverse engineering projects from crash sites of human-made technologies. So just imagine airplanes falling down in a battlefield. Of course, you want to retrieve them and figure out the technologies. Of course, you will have biologics there. And of course, you might, the intelligence might use some code names for those and call them aliens. And then someone looks at the document and thinks that they recovered real aliens. So that's always a possibility that could trigger some confusion. And until I see the evidence directly, I would not necessarily believe the narrative in Steven Spielberg's movie, where he actually shows at the end, the conclusion of the film, he shows bodies of aliens and videos of those that were in possession of the US government.
Fernanda Perez 8418 asks, if an advanced extraterrestrial civilization wanted to contact humanity, why would it choose governments or the UN rather than communicating directly with individuals, given that no institution truly, I assume, represents everybody? In other words, why not talk directly to all of us as opposed to a government or the UN?
Well, of course, the only reason the government may have useful data is because they monitor the sky and the oceans for national security purposes. If you think about the defense budget, it's $1 trillion. That's a factor. It's 99% of our expenditure. 1% is science. So obviously, when scientists use equipment to monitor the sky, they have very low budgets compared to what the military and the intelligence agencies are using. Just about 15 years ago, there were a number of mirrors donated by the intelligence agencies to astronomy. Those represent the previous generation of those satellites being used by the intelligence agencies. And they gave it, and the astronomers were thrilled to use them in an upcoming mission, the Nancy Grace Roman Observatory. But this just illustrates how far the scientific community is behind the intelligence agency in terms of resources, in terms of the ability to manufacture mirrors in space, for example. So that, to me, implies that they have better chances at finding some anomalies, some unusual objects, because they keep doing it. Astronomers focus on a small portion of the sky at any given time, and they ignore objects flying overhead. And actually, they completely ignore the subject of UAPs within the mainstream of astronomy. So there is a good reason to expect governments, and in particular the US government, which spends about a third of the military budgets worldwide, to be the first to notice something unusual. And there are examples in the past of the US government making discoveries for astronomy. For example, in the late 1960s, there was a program called the Vela satellite program to monitor gamma ray flashes from nuclear explosions above the atmosphere. That the suspicion was that the Soviet Union would test nuclear weapons, even though they signed a ban on such tests. and therefore there was an attempt to verify that they're abiding by that ban that was a treaty between the US and the Soviet Union at the time. And then they noticed that every day or two, there is a flash of gamma rays. These Vela satellites were noticing flashes of gamma rays, the gamma ray bursts. And so for several years, they looked into the data and then realized that it's actually coming from the universe. And so then in 1972, there was a scientific paper by people in Los Alamos basically saying there are gamma ray bursts coming from the universe. And at first, astronomers thought, oh, maybe it's from the Milky Way galaxy, because otherwise you need a huge amount of energy to be released in an explosion. So they thought maybe they're related to neutron stars, which have strong magnetic fields. But then it was realized that they actually originate from the edge of the universe, these gamma rays, and they represent a huge amount of energy of order 10 to the 51 ergs released in a single explosion. That's huge. And we can see those at great distances. It ended up being basically the signals associated with the birth of black holes, stellar mass black holes. When a massive star collapses to make a black hole after it consumes its nuclear fuel, what happens is the material may have some rotation because the star was rotating. And then you have the core of the star making a disk that inspirals to get to the black hole, just like water going down the drain. And then in the process of doing so, there are jets being created perpendicular to that disk. And the jet can drill a hole through the envelope of the star before the star had a chance even to explode. And so you end up with those jets penetrating through the envelope. And if the observer lines up with the axis of a jet, it would appear as a gamma ray flash. So gamma ray bursts were discovered by the US government as it was monitoring the Soviet Union. And those happen to be, the signals from the formation of stellar mass black holes. Quite amazing. So that's one example, but maybe UAP will be the first discovery of non-human intelligence, which would be the biggest discovery ever made by humanity. So I give the government credit. My colleagues do not do that very often. Just to give you another example, the government detected a very bright meteor that was moving very fast back in 2014. And I realized that it's, together with my student, that it moves so fast that it must have originated from outside the solar system. And so that was the first recognized interstellar meteor. We went on an expedition to retrieve materials from it 3 years ago, and there will be a Netflix documentary about it. But my colleagues were giving me a very hard time. They were saying, we don't believe the US government. So there is an issue here of mistrust, the mainstream of the scientific community not allowing the government to make discoveries, even though there is this example of gamma ray bursts. So I would argue that gamma ray bursts and also interstellar meteors were discovered by the US government. And now we are dealing with UAPs. Maybe they are the biggest discovery ever made by humanity, not just by the government. And the United Nations is not doing much on this subject. We shouldn't lump it with the US government. And then, of course, the number of objects that are identified as UAP depend on how many eyes are looking at the sky, how many sensors are monitoring the sky. And those sensors are mostly clustered around strategic assets of the United States. And so you would expect clustering of the reports around the same places. So highly populated regions or military bases often notice unusual objects.
When you have a lot of people looking at the sky.
Right.
I mean, that's what they do. They're Air Force personnel.
Yes.
Naturally, you see more things are picked up.
Exactly.
But the distribution should be flat everywhere.
Right.
Overall.
Yes, there is no evidence for real clustering. So far, if you cross-correlate the number of reports, there is a very strong correlation with the population or with the number of sensors. And we don't have evidence that those visits are necessarily clustered today.
Okay, we have a lot of questions to ask. So Thomas Stone 7207 says, Why haven't we figured out how to capture and use electromagnetic radiation for power or fuel? Surely the effect can be used, and I can think of at least one way we can.
Well, we are using solar panels for exactly that reason, right? We are getting energy from solar radiation. So we definitely use that. In terms of, there is an effort to consider data centers in space. And the idea is that they could be powered by sunlight. There is also an attempt, there is a company that suggests to put mirrors in the sky that will channel sunlight also to Earth also during the nighttime. That would be terrible for astronomy because these mirrors will basically illuminate the night sky in a way that would not allow astronomical observatories to look at the universe at large.
Yes, and I can think of also things like there, really interesting ideas like NASA did tether experiments to take advantage of the magnetic field of Earth and things like that to produce energy.
You mean electromagnetic interactions more generally?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there are many examples. For example, the geomagnetic storms that are triggered by plumes of plasma, coronal mass ejections from the sun. They carry a magnetic field. They have charged particles. So electromagnetic interactions with the magnetosphere of the Earth generate these beautiful lights, the northern lights that we see. Electromagnetism is everywhere. It's the most significant source of energy that we have. And in fact, it's also the best messenger that tells us everything about the universe. Until recently, until 2015, we were using signals from light, from electromagnetic sources to learn even about the Big Bang, the cosmic microwave background. In 2015, we detected for the first time gravitational waves with the LIGO experiment. And since then, we observe the universe also in gravitational waves. There are other particles like neutrinos that are observed, but so far they are not used as a very effective astronomical tool. I mean, every now and then they help us figure out things. We detect neutrinos from the sun, from active galactic nuclei where there are supermassive black holes. But the most important agent that transmits information and energy to Earth is radiation.
All right, Thomas Stone 7207 asks, for years, NASA has said they think Enceladus has life in its ocean. Actually, they say that it might, but it has some conditions for it. Maybe they haven't gone to look because if they find it, it would mean life is everywhere. Your thoughts?
Well, the Enceladus has cracks in the surface ice, out of which we see plumes coming out like geysers. These are jets of water vapor. And indeed, we know that there are some complex molecules there, but there was never a mission to examine the fingerprints of life. Because it's possible that under the thick layer of ice, tens of kilometers deep, there is a liquid ocean. This is very likely, which is warmed up by gravitational tides. And in that ocean, there may be primitive forms of life. And in principle, we can detect signatures of those life forms in the geysers, in these plumes of water vapor coming out. And so one can, in principle, design a mission that would aim to do that. I mean, in principle, if it landed on the surface of this ice, we could check for any fish, lying on the surface that came out from these cracks in the ice. But I think it's very unlikely that there are very advanced forms of life down there, because there is usually, I mean, the theory is that you need an interface between rock, land, and water in order to develop advanced forms of life.
John O'Place asks, sorry if you answered this already. What's up with the sensors? You going to be getting your own, military giving you access to theirs, inventing new ones specific to the task?
Yeah, so my hope is that we can recommend that, I mean, once we look at data and decide that the missing information is this and that. We identify what's missing in order to crack down the mystery. We can say, please try to build sensors that will get us this data. If you remember, many of these videos that were released so far had the redacted information in them. And as long as the information is not classified, I think it would be very useful to know the context. What was the camera attached to? What was the distance between the camera and the objects that we're dealing with? If that is known, having multiple sensors looking at the same object allows also to not only to triangulate and figure out the distance and velocity and acceleration of the object, but also verify that it's a real object and not just an optical illusion. And also it allows to narrow down the possibility of what the object might be. So I would say multi-sensor data would be the most effective in figuring out whether we're dealing with outliers beyond the performance envelope of human-made technologies.
All right. El Abelardo says, Dr. Loeb, actually says Dr. Love. That's interesting, but Dr. Loeb. It would be interesting to manufacture cameras that analyze the infrared and ultraviolet spectrum with integrated artificial intelligence so that they can mark movement vectors and others.
Yeah, that's exactly what we're doing. We are not using ultraviolet radiation, but we look in the infrared and visible light. In the Galileo project, that's exactly what we are doing. And then we analyze the data with artificial intelligence because we can basically train the AI algorithms for identifying objects that are familiar, like airplanes, balloons, drones, and satellites. So indeed, it's not just natural intelligence. We can take advantage of AI because it can deal with large data sets. And eventually it becomes very effective once it learns, once it has a ground truth. And within the Galileo project, we shared some data a month ago with the public just to establish the ground truth for training our AI systems.
All right. Dan Female Foot Muncher Wells says, and there's actually a reason for this question that we could get into. Would finding aliens that look superficially like Norwegians surprise you? Now, mind you, that is a thing. The so-called Nordics, yes, some have said.
Well, okay. So there is a fundamental question that I alluded to in a recent essay. We tend to think that we reach the pinnacle of technology by constructing AI systems right now based on silicon chips. What does it mean? The chips are made out of sand. We take sand and purify it. We extract the silicon and then make chips out of that silicon that comes from sand, a very common ingredient. And that's the foundation for these advanced AI systems that we have. And it's all based on our understanding of quantum mechanics. So that indeed, what the physicists did a century ago is fundamentally important for these new technologies. But we need to invest, as of now, we need to invest gigawatts in these computer systems in order for them to compete with the cognitive abilities of the human brain. And the human brain is using 20 watts. So that raises a very interesting question. Will we, after the AI revolution that we have right now, will we have another revolution that would be far more impressive? And that would be to use biology, chemical reactions to generate the next generation of thinking machines. These would be intelligent systems that are a scaled up version of the human brain. And there might not be a limit if you understand how to construct them, just in the way that currently we are scaling up the AI systems that we are developing. And those biological, synthetic biology systems, we will basically engineer biological brains and make them much more powerful than silicon-based brains. Now, the reason I thought about that is because I got a question from a student in France who asked me, we haven't yet encountered any self-replicating intelligent probes, the way that John von Neumann envisioned in 1950. He argued that once an advanced civilization can generate self-replicating intelligent probes, they can go places and multiply. And so even if they move at, let's say, 1% of the speed of light, they can colonize the entire galaxy within 100,000 years. Very short time compared to the age of the universe, which is 13.8 billion years. So if we don't see them around us, then doesn't it mean that there is no very advanced civilization that generates self-replicating probes? And I told him in reply that I interact every day with intelligent self-replicating probes. They're called humans. And potentially, once we reach the technological level to manufacture biological brains, through synthetic biology, we could send them as ambassadors, as we can send them to interstellar space as the future astronauts, rather than sending versions of ourselves, because they might have bigger brains, they might have bigger cognitive abilities, just like we scale up the current silicon chips in AI systems. And so just imagine another civilization deciding to do that. Perhaps they put us here on this planet because we are so different from animals. I mean, of course, we share a common DNA, but they could have taken a relatively low-level brain that existed on Earth and sort of introduced a change to it through synthetic biology to make humans. And so I don't know if we have no evidence for self-replicating probes that are intelligent. I think we do, actually. And the fundamental question is whether when we meet aliens, visiting us, will we see robots with AI made out of silicon chips and the materials that we are currently making robots out of? Or will we see biological creatures that were a result of synthetic biology that are not necessarily, the manufacturers of those visitors, those ambassadors? So that's a very interesting question. It brings up our origin, into focus. We maybe in the future will figure it out. We'll realize that we are here because of some interstellar gardener. But it also asks the question of what will we encounter, and that's why I think we should not be too affected by the script of Spielberg's film. He shows images of aliens, but I'm not sure. Now, with respect to specifically Nordics, if I don't know if the U.S. government has bodies, but it may well be that if we're dealing with human-made technologies that were retrieved, there would be different ethnic origins for the pilots, and they refer to it with code names, and one was Nordics. I just haven't seen any direct evidence to indicate these types of aliens are in possession. And I told my colleague at Harvard, Professor Stein Jacobson, who helped me analyze the materials we retrieved from the Pacific Ocean. He's originally from Norway, and he did a DNA test, and he realized that he is a descendant of the Vikings, and he's very proud of that. So I told him, I will defend your ancestry. I will defend it against those who claim that you are extraterrestrial.
Interesting. Now, a traveling lighter one, and I have to point out we have questions backing up, so we probably want to get
shorter answers. Okay.
Yes. Traveling lighter one asks, isn't it more likely, considering the vast distances of space, that intelligent alien life are hidden ancient civilizations under the Earth's crust?
Well, we don't know how long ago they came here. I mean, humans just came to the scene over the last few million years. That's tiny. That's at 1 part in 1,000 of the age of the age of the Earth, and the Earth itself arrived just in the last 1/3 of cosmic history. So we just arrived late to this stage, and we have no clue. And they could have been around for a while. And then the question is, would we distinguish them from an Earth-based civilization that preceded us? That's another possibility, that we are not the first on this Earth We tend to think that way, but maybe that's not the case. 252 million years ago, there was a major global warming event of the type that we are being warned about. That global warming was very sudden, and it's uh, associated with volcanic activity and other geological events on Earth. But imagine that there was an advanced civilization that basically inflicted the wounds on itself and disappeared. If it happened 252 million years ago, all of the relics are buried now because the Earth had a lot of mixing of the outer layer with the interior of the Earth. So we will not find their computer terminals easily in archaeological digs. These are open questions as to how long ago did the intelligence arrive at Earth. But the fundamental question that we can address is whether we find any physical objects that represent non-human origin. And that's what we are trying to do. As to where they came from and how long they were around, these are follow-up questions.
User YC8YY5GP5X. Yes, that's a random name there. Professor Avi Loeb, do you feel the current administration is supportive of you, this panel, and any potential findings? We are all lucky to have you. I agree with this question. It's very important.
Yeah, I see a very good sense of partnership, collaboration. I visited the Aero a year ago, and it was hosted by Dr. John Kozlowski and his team. I had a frank discussion with them, and my interpretation of what we are seeing is that they are just puzzled. They have some events that they cannot explain, of course, many others that they can. It's a mixed bag. UAP or UFOs, most of them are probably have mundane explanations. But, the question we are trying to address is whether any object out of millions that might be recognized as unidentified, even if one is of non-human origin, that would be the biggest discovery ever made. So that's really the difficulty. And my sense is that if the Pentagon, for example, realizes that 97% of the objects can be figured out and 3%, they just don't know what they are, they would say, okay, we have very pressing issues to deal with. They're not a scientific organization, so they would simply leave those unresolved cases on the side and say, well, maybe sometime in the future we'll figure them out, but for now let's put that aside. Now, why wouldn't they release it to the public until recently? The answer is simple, because they would say, let's be risk averse. Let's not expose our failure to the public or to adversarial nations, because maybe there is a chance these objects are a national security threat. Maybe they represent technologies that other nations possess and we don't know about it. So just because of that possibility, let's keep it under wraps. And that would be my guess. And then they don't get scrutinized for not doing their job. I mean, there was the Chinese spy balloon that was shut down in 2023. And, when you find an ant on a kitchen cabinet, you get alarmed because you realize there should be many more ants in the kitchen. And if you shoot down one Chinese spy balloon, there should be a lot of drones and balloons that the Chinese launched that are spying on the US. And we might not recognize all of them. Maybe some of the orbs are technologies we don't know about. And so they would just put it under wraps and classify it. And until, of course, there was this new directive from President Trump. And of course, now the psychology is different. And now they're sharing a part of that data, and they're asking for advice from scientists. So I see that it's an opportunity to resolve the issue. It's like a detective story. And if we can contribute, if the scientists on the board can help figure things out, that would be great. Because if it turns out that everything is human-made, we help national security, we help the Pentagon do its job. But if it turns out that something else is out there, that would be amazing, wouldn't it? And so let's try and get more data, more evidence. It's not about storytelling. It's about seeing the evidence and analyzing it, getting better evidence. The thing about past reports is you cannot go back in time. You have to collect new data in order to figure things better.
Collect a new, fresh data set.
Right.
At Thomas Stone 7207 asks, are there any remote star systems with only one star with an Earth-like planet circling, not in a tidally locked orbit, a real Earth analog? I'm assuming a Type G star with, more distant habitable zone.
Yeah, I mean, we do have such examples. I had a recent paper talking about the habitable zone of very massive stars because they are very bright, and so the habitable zone is pushed to be beyond the extent of the planetary system around the sun, actually. But those massive stars, they evolve very quickly within a few million years. So there is only a very short window of opportunity for life to emerge near them. They're not good places, and that may explain why we live next to the sun. Uh, you may ask, why don't we live next to a dwarf star? Because dwarf stars are far more abundant. And the answer is, I mean, we do have an example near us. It's called Proxima Centauri, 12% of the mass of the sun. And there happens to be a planet, Proxima b. There is also a second planet that are in the habitable zone of Proxima Centauri. And the problem with these dwarf stars that are the most abundant types of stars, there are 10 times more of them, down to 7% of the mass of the sun. The problem with them is that they flare a lot. And when you get to the habitable zone, because they're fainter, the habitable zone is closer to them. So they are the planets there are much more vulnerable to these flares that can strip the atmosphere from the planet and basically sterilize the planet from any form of life. And so that may explain why we don't live next to the most common star. I mean, the most common stars, not only that they are more numerous, but they also live up to 1,000 times the lifespan of solar-like stars, sun-like stars. So we should have lived next to a Loma star in the future. That's the most common, habitable zone, but we don't. We live next to the sun right now, and the answer is probably because of the flares of those Loma stars that sterilize the habitable planets around them. And with respect to multiple star systems, actually half of the stars of the sun-like stars have a companion. The sun doesn't. And there are systems with double stars, binaries or even triples that do have planets.
Christina 5178 asks, will you or have you spoken with Congress in regards to data being released about 3I Atlas into the UFO files?
Well, that's an interesting question. I mean, the CIA was asked about it in a Freedom of Information Act request, whether they have any records about 3I Atlas, and they replied that we cannot deny nor confirm such records. My guess is that they didn't dig very deep into it. They were just following all the data that was obtained by telescopes, either in space or on the ground. And they probably had conversations about the question of whether, if it happens to be technological, whether it would affect society, whether there would be an effect on the financial markets, on societal unrest. And so for that reason, they probably discussed it. But, again, they are not a scientific organization. However, this is, if it's true that they discussed it, it's the first time that an astronomical object was discussed within the CIA, within the intelligence agencies. I'm not aware of any other case.
The Vela satellites, because they actually kept the gamma ray bursts.
Oh, okay, but
they
didn't really know what the gamma ray bursts are. But I'm talking here about an object, actually.
Yes. Okay, Michelle McAllister 2962 asks, what was the selection criteria for the council? Is it an intentional skills-based council, or are they appointed?
That's an excellent question. And so first, I wanted to get a few nerds, young scientists that are very fluent in the latest AI systems and are very quick to analyze any new data that we get. It's really important to have this energy within a team, an A team. So I had a few of those that are not easily recognizable. They're not senior members of academia that you would immediately recognize as very distinguished scientists, but they might actually make the most important contributions. That's my hope. I always believe in young people because they have less baggage, and they also are fluent with the latest technical details, technical advances, the techniques. Right now, it's AI agents. Using that for the benefit of science is one of the emerging frontiers. And I see postdocs right now that I work with that when I give them a task that 5 years ago used to take them months, they can within hours resolve the issue. And I'm really impressed because I have a lot of experience, and I would address this question in a particular way, and it turns out the AI is doing it just the right way if it's being trained correctly. So it's really impressive. The interface with AI for the advance of science, is really impressive. So that's why I had these few young members. And then I also selected, of course, members with expertise in physics, oceanography, psychology, because we are talking about many reports coming from humans that interact with UAP. So we need to understand the human mind. And then statistics, that's very important because some of these appearances are extremely rare, and we need to quantify how rare these are. And so I had selected a lot of members with diverse set of skills. And the one common thread among them is that they are all brilliant. I know them personally. And, I didn't want to select necessarily people with a clear narrative on the subject, people with a lot of baggage. I wanted people that think creatively, willing to innovate. And then, of course, I added a communication officer, Ross Howard, who is actually producing this session, because we need to communicate with the public and we need to communicate with the media. And in terms of the size of the council, I didn't want it to be too small because if you have just a small number of people, first, you don't have all the expertise that you need. But in addition, a small team is very sensitive to the views, the opinions of the members, and you can get large fluctuations in terms of the decisions being made. They can be incomplete because of the small number of opinions. And then if you make it too big, then there is a theorem in statistics called the central limit theorem, which basically says that a system with a large number of independent representations is regressing to the mean. So a big committee shows regression to the mean opinion. And you might say, oh, that's great because we are converging at the consensus opinion. No, that's bad for innovation because, the central limit theorem says that the fractional deviation from the mean scales as the inverse of the square root of the number of committee members. And so you don't want the number of committee members to be too large because then basically the conclusions will be boring. If you look at big committees, they always reach boring conclusions. They always converge at things that are not particularly inspiring or innovative. So there is sort of a sweet spot. And currently the committee has about 15 members, and that's the sweet spot.
Now, we have a very nuanced question, but it's a very important one from the Friar Eli. Avi, what avenues will you use to obtain as much quality UAP data as possible from the governance board? Which that's an important point here. And will you leverage your ties to Representative Luna's task force in the House for additional data requests?
Yeah, so I didn't mention, but there is also a UAP governing board that the council reports to, and that includes representatives from the White House, from the Director of National Intelligence Office, from AERO, and from the intelligence community, and also from Congress. And so I will report to that group of people, and of course, we will work together. It's a collaborative effort. Two of those lawmakers already tweeted about the council. There was a tweet by Representative Luna that blessed the council and wished us success, and another one by Representative Burleson yesterday. So definitely there would be cooperation, and this is a multi-organization effort. And what is most important is that there is a sense of a team here, of partnership in trying to follow the directive from President Trump. And that's extremely important, because the deliberations in the past, some people that if you look at the X, you will find people who are, first of all, they denied the existence of the council. Second, they said, the composition doesn't make sense. Third, they said, that this council would just resemble the previous committees that were established and didn't really find anything. First, I don't understand why these people are so negative. Why? I mean, if you care about UAPs, just give your blessing and celebrate the existence of this council and encourage it to do impactful work. Why not be positive? It's just like imagining, a team of basketball players, and the audience just tells them, then nothing will come out of you playing. I mean, you will not really win any game, and because in the past a lot of teams lost, and why do you exist? And in fact, maybe it's all fake. And I mean, I just don't understand this spirit. The Knicks would have never won with such an attitude of their audience. So we should celebrate the fact that the US government is coming forward in partnership with scientists. This is an opportunity for us to have a future that is better than the past. Why are we thinking that the future will be as bad as the past? The whole point of this is to get new evidence that will educate us. It's a learning experience. And, I'm always optimistic. I want to do well, and I would try not to disappoint anyone that has trust in our council, and we will do our best. Now, of course, we might not, the quality of our deliberations will depend on the quality of the data that we get from the government. That's obviously the case. But, we will try to make the best lemonade out of any lemons that we get. And just cheer for that. Just try to encourage us, because we will try to do the best we can from a scientific perspective. That's the only perspective that can bring us to the truth, because it's evidence-based. It's not belief-based. It's not story-based. I mean, look at the judicial system, at the court, the legal system. There are many examples, dozens of examples, where people were put on death row as a result of eyewitness testimonies under oath. Okay, so you can't, and so they were sent to die because someone said that they are absolutely sure, under oath, that they are the criminals, that they should be punished by death. And then somehow DNA evidence came along and exonerated them. How do you explain that? There are many cases like that. You can explain that because you cannot trust humans, storytelling. Even if those humans are absolutely convinced that they are correct, they are wrong sometimes, okay? And the only way to figure it out is by DNA testing, okay? And when you have that evidence, you can arrive at definitive conclusions. So we are trying to get a DNA test of those orbs, of those UFOs, UAPs. We are trying to get to the data that will convince everyone about their nature. That's what we are trying to do. And so how can you not be happy about this process? This is the best path forward. And, if we end up concluding something different than the belief system of some people, so be it. It was the belief system of the Vatican, of most people on earth, that the sun moves around the earth, and they adapted to it. If we have a neighbor, we have to tell everyone, and everyone will adapt to it. I mean, it's the physical reality that we need to adapt to. We can have wishful thinking. We can think that we have $1 trillion in the bank. There is one person who has that, Elon Musk, but other than that, we can enjoy this illusion until we go to the bank and check how much we have in our bank account. So this reality check is really important, because humans very often have wishful thinking, and we get a lot of pleasure out of that. And actually, Steven Spielberg's obligation, you have to understand that, as a movie director, Steven Spielberg produces a movie that will bring pleasure to the audience. That's his goal. Okay, so he puts some red meat in that script just to make the audience happy. It doesn't mean that it's real. This is his imagination, artistic freedom. It's very different than actually engaging with the physical reality that we live in and trying to figure out what is out there in reality, not on the movie set, not on the movie screen. That's a very different, much more difficult task, because we are constrained by the laws of physics. We're constrained by the evidence. We can't just dream up the answer. But many people on social media dream up the answer. They already know the answer. They don't need the evidence. They have a very strong belief system. But, that will not bring us closer to resolving the nature of UAPs.
Truth can be stranger than fiction. Always keep that in mind. Professor Loeb asks, user YC8YY5GP5X. It's a good thing I'm very good at remembering star catalog numbers and rattling them off. Will there be regular updates to the public from the board, or will we just find out after the fact? In short, will you be issuing reports based on what you're being handed by the?
Yeah. So I would highly recommend that you follow my essays on medium.com. I post an update every day or most of the time. And if there will be something important, you will see it there. I have 155,000 followers there. And so just subscribe to that. It's free. I don't charge anything. I'm not making money out of my research. When I went to the expedition to the Pacific Ocean, there were some people who asked, if we get access to your materials, we are willing to support your expedition. I'm not doing it for profit. I don't want the profit. It's all about curiosity-driven research. And so when I write those essays on medium.com, they're offered for free, and you're welcome to subscribe and just follow the advances. And if you subscribe right now, you will see the essay from yesterday that described the console that we were talking about. And earlier that week, you will see a lot of interesting updates. So just stay tuned.
Michelle McAllister 2962 asks, with all the data surfacing around nuclear infrastructure, these things show up around nuclear carriers, they show up around nuclear power plants, and some say missiles and things like that. Would you not start there and look first at the nuclear energy aspect of this?
I don't need to start there, because the US government has a lot of sensors there. And by the way, that may be the reason why more such visits are identified near these strategic assets, simply because there are more eyes on the sky, more sensors looking up. And that could be part of the clustering of reports around those sites. But the point is that because they are strategic, we do have a lot of data of what's going on around them, as well as around military bases. So, the question is, what does the data show? And I mentioned before a report from 2023 that indicated a sequence of events that were not explained. 40% of the phenomena there were not explained. That's the report from Dr. John Kozlowski. So there is data. We can ask for some of it that was not as of yet released to be released to the council and the public. And we can put new sensors around these sites so that we get higher quality data. If such things cluster, these indeed would be the best places for us to put the sensors. I should explain that within the Galileo project, I try to avoid strategic sites because I don't want to interfere with the government operations. I don't want to bring my sensors to classified sites. So I avoided those, but the government should not avoid those, and we can advise them to put sensors there just to resolve the mystery.
Kelly P1Z asks, Avi, why do you only do interviews on News Nation and other right-leaning news and not CNN or BBC or NPR?
Oh, that's not true, actually. I do have quite a few of them. My appearances reflect the invitations. And I would love to be on all of the above. And I do. I was interviewed by Jack Tapper on CNN. I was on the BBC many times. But it so happens that News Nation and the Newsmax are very interested in the subject. They keep inviting me. And by the way, I should explain this subject of UAP is not a political matter. There are people on both sides of the aisle, in Congress and in the Senate, that are cooperating. It's always one subject that brings both parties together. You don't see a disparity. In fact, even the most extreme progressive people are excited about it, and together with the most the extreme on the other side of the political spectrum. So this subject is completely apolitical, but within the media, it does have a political bent, because there is this notion within the mainstream of academia that this is nothing, and this subject had a stigma for many years. I had to resist that stigma. I got a lot of pushback. There is clearly a lot of pushback and resentment within the mainstream of scientists. And because some of the outlets that you mentioned are influenced by those mainstream practitioners, they don't ask me to appear on their programs. That's their problem. That's their fault, because they're not following the latest advances. But ultimately, just like the Vatican admitted Galileo was right, if we end up getting enough evidence, I'm sure that my calendar will be filled with interviews on all over the map. There was one day when the first release of UFO files came out that I had 23 interviews in one day. So just coordinating them and allowing one to follow the other was a huge task for me, because I had to do it myself. I cannot employ my assistant in that, because then it will double the amount of time I spend on coordinating. I will have to tell the assistant when and how to put these interviews in a sequence. And so and since then, every day I have 5 to 10 interviews, and I see that as an opportunity to communicate the excitement of science to the public. I get a lot of emails from parents who tell me that their kids are now excited to become scientists because they saw me on TV. That's a great, that's the biggest reward that I can imagine, if this gives inspiration to kids to become scientists. Because right now, science is not really appreciated much in society by the public. Maybe that was partly the result of the COVID pandemic, where the public, some constituencies within the public lost confidence in the scientific advice they get. It's also a result of some members of the public viewing science as as an occupation of the elite. That's definitely not true for me. I grew up on a farm. I came from a very modest background, and I ended up where I am just because of my curiosity. And I was born in another country, and I managed to make it here. And so science is definitely not an occupation of the elite. I do not regard myself as part of the elite. I speak with any person who wants to speak with me, and and I don't feel in any way superior to others. And when there was a plumber one day that came to fix the sewer at my home, and I spent hours speaking with him, sitting on the steps leading to our home, and talking about life, about the physics, any question that he might have. I don't see science as an occupation. In fact, science is really a great blessing because it allows us to maintain our childhood curiosity. And, when I see people, adults, I always try to imagine how they were as kids. And how many occupations allow you to ask questions, not to pretend that you know the answer, and to treat your life as a learning experience. This is just the approach of a kid. And I haven't changed much since I was a kid. So anyway, it's really something that needs to be fixed. The image of science, it needs to be reimagined as and one way to do that is by scientists like myself being engaged with a subject that the public cares a lot about. The UFO files that were released, that webpage from the Department of War, it received within a few weeks 1 billion views. 1 billion. How many websites receive 1 billion views within a few weeks? And this just shows you how viral this subject is. And all I'm saying is that it can be part of scientific research. My colleagues in academia are saying, no, we don't want to hear about that. And then outlets connected to them like CNN and NPR are not covering it. The New York Times are not covering it. But it's a missed opportunity because this should be a subject that is studied by scientists in the mainstream, because at the very least we're helping the government maintain safety of strategic assets. But we might actually discover something we haven't expected. So why not be open-minded? The mainstream of science looked for the nature of dark matter for decades, and we invested billions of dollars, haven't found what it is. Why is that more legitimate than figuring out the nature of UAPs? Both are very strange mysteries. And the second one is actually has an impact on society that could be huge. So why not invest in that as well? And that's a question that you should ask NPR, you should ask CNN, and you should ask mainstream scientists. Exactly this question. You shouldn't ask me why I'm not appearing there. You should ask them why they don't invite me to discuss it.
All right, Dr. Thing on a Thing in a Thing asks, Avi, is this council designed to eventually receive biological materials evidence, or to permanently absorb and neutralize disclosure pressure by producing inconclusive scientific reports forever? Have to point out, I noticed who you're appointing, and you've got 2 materials scientists on there.
Exactly. And in fact, we have a very interesting result that hopefully we will be able to disclose from the Galileo project in the coming months about the studies of the materials that we retrieved from the Pacific Ocean. Just stay tuned for that. Once the paper gets accepted for publication, we'll come out with more details. But definitely there are people who specialize in material science, and that would be an important part of the analysis if the government is willing to share with us related data.
Yeah, it's interesting. I definitely noticed that with Gary Nolan, and he's probably the top guy for this sort of work, and he's got the lab at Stanford. So
he does, and I also have Stein Jacobson, the Nordic, who is not an alien. He's a descendant of the Vikings, and he has one of the best labs in the world analyzing materials. He's a world-renowned geochemist, and we did our work on the analysis of the expedition materials with him.
Now, Richard Vesey 4762 asks, will you ask President Trump to declassify crashed craft if they exist? Will you directly ask the president, if you have to, regarding this?
Well, if I had the knowledge of that, that would definitely be my inclination. As I said before, if you find a tennis ball thrown by a neighbor and you realize that you do have a neighbor, you have to disclose this fact to your family members, because that's the reality that we live in. It makes no sense to hide the existence of a neighbor from the general public in our cosmic environment. I don't know it for a fact, so it's possible the government has no such clue. And I haven't seen directly such. I know about stories, about testimonies, but I haven't seen directly the evidence. And maybe it exists. If it exists, I would definitely express this sentiment.
Here's an interesting question. John H2S5V asks, can deep sea deuterium depletion detect USOs, which are the underwater version of the UFOs?
That's an interesting question, except that, the oceans are carry a lot of water. So if there is any isotopic signature of those USOs, submerged objects, it will be diluted by the vast amount of water around them. However, in principle, one can pick it up because we have very sensitive probes. For example, in the latest analysis that we did in the laboratory of Stein-Jacobson, we were able to get down to a sensitivity of 1 part in maybe even down to 1 part in a trillion. So yeah, in principle, if we see evidence for anomalous objects, we can examine the water around them and see if there is any anomaly. I should say that in terms of deuterium, since you brought it up, 3I Atlas had a plume of gas around it, and deuterium was found in that plume at an abundance which is 1,000 times bigger than the average cosmic abundance. So I did a simple calculation because Edward Teller, back in the days of the Manhattan Project, he really worried. He asked the question, if we ignite a nuclear weapon, a nuclear bomb, will it produce a chain reaction in the atmosphere or in the oceans? For example, in the oceans, it could be the deuterium that will get burned. And in the atmosphere, it was nitrogen related. So Hans Bethe, the physicist, one of the members of the Manhattan Project, calculated that radiative losses would cool the fireball very quickly, so there will not be a chain reaction. But I wanted to repeat the calculation in the context of 3I Atlas, because Edward Teller said, also later in his life, towards the end of his life, he said that if we see an object approaching Earth and we want to deflect it so that it will not kill us, like the asteroid that killed the dinosaurs, we might detonate a nuclear bomb, a gigaton of TNT equivalent. And so I said, okay, well, let's imagine that a gigaton of TNT equivalent nuclear bomb is exploded near 3I Atlas. And given that 3I Atlas has 1,000 times the deuterium abundance, the average cosmic abundance, will that ignite 3I Atlas? And I did the calculation, and it misses by a couple of orders of magnitude. It will not ignite an object like 3I Atlas, but it wasn't very far actually from, because imagine a kilometer-sized iceberg being ignited by our own nuclear detonator. That would have been like a spectacular, but it would have obviously damaged the Earth a lot, even at a distance.
Yeah, that's interesting that it was kind of getting in the ballpark. That's
yeah,
a little disturbing.
It's disturbing. Another thing in terms of the chemical composition of the plume of gas around 3I Atlas is that there was methane detected only after the object passed close to the sun. And I'm about to release a paper within a few days with my student, Shokruz Kakarov, where we calculated how, what mass of microbes do you need in order to produce this methane? Because maybe if there were some microbes near the surface of 3I Atlas and they were exposed to sunlight, close to perihelion, that warmed them up, they started processing the nutrients within this iceberg and releasing methane. And we have some very interesting results. You don't need a lot of them, actually. And that's one way of getting panspermia. You can imagine microbes in icebergs being transported from one planetary system to another. So stay tuned for this paper. Hopefully within a few days, you'll see the details.
Oh, I'm waiting for that one. All right. Andrew I 2001 asks, asks, will you push back openly if you feel your efforts are being blocked by higher ups? Wish you and your team the best from New Zealand.
Yeah, so I have a busy schedule. I have a lot of things I want to do. I have new ideas every day. If I see that this is a waste of time, why would I do that? I mean, at some point in life, I'm not very young. When you are young, you say, okay, I'll do crazy stuff. But when you get to my age, you have to plan to make the best use of the time that you have left. Now, of course, maybe AI assisted medicine will extend the longevity of my generation, maybe. That'd be great, because then I can address those unresolved questions for much longer than I currently can. So, but I have a few decades left. I have to really plan of the best use of my time, and I would not waste it on a back and forth, exchange that leads to nothing. Why would I do that?
All right. Walkerdale 6602 asks, hi, Dr. Loeb. If you discover through the Galileo project we are being visited, will you still tell the public immediately, regardless of NDAs signed with the advisory council? I'm assuming you won't have any. Am I correct?
I don't have right now. I don't know what the future will hold, but as of now, but if I'm let's say, I mean, obviously, if I'm not signed on anything, I'll try to promote the dissemination of that information. But if I'm signed, I will try to convince those authorities that signed me on it to share it with the public, because I believe, as I said before, that this is that all humans need to know about it, because sooner or later they will find out. So, it makes no sense to behave like the Vatican, 400 years ago.
All right. Wally the Honey Badger asks an astronomical question. Are black holes voids
No, well,
of particles dash energy within the Higgs boson field?
So, no, I mean, you can think of black holes as extreme structures of space-time. So the simplest way to imagine how they form, they don't exist they don't exist necessarily from the Big Bang. They must have formed at some point. And so, for example, if you have a massive star, as I mentioned previously with respect to these gamma ray bursts, a massive star has a core that burns the nuclear fuel. A star is just a nuclear reactor that is held together by gravity. So when the core consumes the nuclear fuel, it loses its pressure support against gravity, and it collapses to make a black hole. So all the material in the core of the star is being drained, just like water going down the drain. It's being concentrated, and eventually it gets dense enough such that the gravitational escape speed, the speed needed to escape from this sphere of matter that keeps contracting, is bigger than the speed of light. So even light cannot escape from there. I mean, so if you imagine this core, initially you get the light coming out, I mean, heat being emitted by the radiation coming out of it. But then once it gets to be sufficiently compact, the escape speed is higher than the speed of light. So even light cannot escape from the very strong gravity associated with it. Now, in Einstein's theory of gravity, gravity is simply the curvature of space-time. And so the first solution to Einstein's equations were obtained by Karl Schwarzschild. He went to the German front during the First World War and wrote a postcard where he derived the first analytic solution to Einstein's equations. Einstein published them in November 1915, and just half a year later, Einstein published the work of Schwarzschild, and a few months later, Karl Schwarzschild died. He was a patriot. He was Jewish, fighting for the Germans, and felt like a patriot that he left his directorship at the Potsdam Observatory to help the German nation to win the war. And actually, he died, and the war was devastating, for the German. I mean, they didn't really gain much territory. They actually felt that they were humiliated, and that's why they started the Second World War. But anyway, Schwarzschild lost his life, but just before that, I mean, that was a result of a rare lung disease that he acquired at the front. But just before that, he derived a solution to Einstein's equations in the form of a black hole solution. And that's a black hole that is not spinning. Einstein was a pacifist. He didn't volunteer. He didn't go to the military to fight for the German nation. And therefore, he lived for many more decades after that. You can draw your lessons as to the lifespan of people with different political views. Pacifists are usually much longer lived. But at any event, this solution of Schwarzschild serves as the basis for the description of black holes. And what happens to this sphere of material as it continues to contract is unclear, because according to Einstein's equations, it creates a singularity, a point in space that has an infinite curvature. And that's at that point, simply the theory breaks down, and singularities occur for theories that are not complete. It's clear what we are missing with Einstein's gravity. We are missing quantum mechanics, which is very important at extremely high densities of matter. And so the hope is that once we combine Einstein's equations with the theory of quantum mechanics in the appropriate way, we will have a unified theory of quantum gravity that will resolve the singularity. As to what happens at the singularity, nobody knows. My personal favorite model is that this sphere that we were talking about of matter that continues to contract ends up with a finite size when it reaches the Planck density, which is the highest density that matter can achieve. And then you build a very compact star at the center of the black hole. So there is this compact star at the Planck density. We can't see it because it's hidden behind the event horizon. Event horizon is also the name of the program that John and Ross are producing. But the way to think about the black hole is that it's, you can say that it's similar to Las Vegas. What happens inside never stays there, never comes out. And that's definitely not true of Las Vegas, because we put an observatory there and we're getting data from there. So, and also it's not true, strictly speaking, about black holes, because when you add quantum mechanics, black holes radiate Hawking radiation. That's a separate phenomena. But most of the Hawking radiation that is associated with astrophysical black holes is not observable.
So you invoked me on event horizon, so I have to go into event horizon mode with a follow-up real quick. All right, so you're suggesting, in your view, that inside the event horizon of the black hole, when you look at the singularity, it basically represents a previously unknown degeneracy pressure,
yes,
dependent on the Planck scale.
Yes, and you end up with a very compact remnant there, and we can't see it. So even when two black holes collide and produce gravitational waves, LIGO cannot see the nuggets in the middle because they're hidden behind an event horizon. So the gravitational waves do not carry any information about these stars, the black hole star at the center that I was mentioning. And of course, one way to figure out if they exist is to get inside a black hole. I highly recommend it for string theorists, because then they can test their theory if they go. And I mentioned it in a conference when I was director of the Black Hole Initiative, and Nimar Kani Hamed, one of the string theorists in the audience, shouted that you have an ulterior motive of sending us into a black hole. But I didn't deny that.
All right, Doctor, I have another event horizon question, and then I promise I'll go back to audience questions.
Okay.
Right. On the panel, there is the possibility of ontological shock among scientists if you find something very, very, very unusual. I noticed you have somebody on there that deals specifically in anomalies and
Yes,
philosophy. And
right.
you know who I'm talking about.
Yeah,
And
Carol Cleland, and she's brilliant, and
absolutely brilliant. I've
yeah.
interviewed her, and I noticed her presence there, and I'm like, he's preparing for ontological shock in
By
case.
the way, I had a conversation today. I met with the team, and she told us that as a young kid, she was told about the UAP, UFO. So for her, it's actually closing a circle, and she's fascinated with this topic, and we will benefit greatly from her wisdom.
There are several people on there that have seen UAP. So there are, as you would say, experiencers among the scientific advisory board.
Mhm.
Now, Matthew Evans, 7841, asks, in Dr. Rutledge's field study of UFOs, he saw a pseudo satellite that acted like one, but then it made a right hand turn. And how do you take into account that UFOs act like other phenomenon, known ones, to disguise? In other words, can a UAP disguise itself as a satellite? And then and that actually evokes Steven Spielberg again with Close Encounters of the Third Kind, where they look like stars, and then all of a sudden they're moving. How do
Yeah,
you
that
deal with
we know this trick from nature, right? The camouflage. It happens a lot, and yeah, that's possible. But again, if you have good enough data, if you have a camera with a very rapid frame rate, you could capture that.
the question is, how do you distinguish something that's identical to something you
Oh,
know? So,
if it's identical, you can't distinguish it by definition. But there is always a small difference, and that's with good enough data. That's what we are hoping to notice. Of course, if it looks exactly the same as something else, you need to probe it in a different way, right? So even in that case, if another object interacts with it, like if it has an encounter with another medium like water or something, if someone shoots at it, and some witnesses did report about trying to shoot UFOs, UAPs. If there is an interaction with another object, then of course we can learn much more about it. There was also the Hellfire missile, if you remember that in a video. So whenever there is an interaction, it really helps because it gives us more data. And it's sort of like, when you want to figure out the nature of an object, like a kid sees an object at a distance, the kid will go to it and touch it and move it around, turn it around, trying to figure out what it is. An adult, like the mainstream scientists that pretend to be the adult in the room, they would say, we pretty much know what this is. We don't need to waste time in checking. But that's why I like so much the attitude, of the approach of kids, because they go and check things.
at Richard Vesey 4762 has a question for me. JMG, apology that I haven't followed you for a spell. Are you still a skeptic? Probably not, since you are emceeing this. Thank you very much for this. All right, Richard, I am a skeptic of an alien origin for UAP. I need evidence, which is what Dr. Loeb is looking for. I need evidence that will lead me to that conclusion, and I can come up with a lot of conclusions that I like before that. I am not a skeptic that people see things in the sky that they cannot explain.
I should. I wanted to add to what you just said. Some people criticized me for including within the team of the council a skeptic, and I try to explain that it's really important to have a devil's advocate in any committee, because you need to make sure that there are no biases or echo chambers or tribal thinking within the committee. So it's really important to have people with different opinions, and this is not appreciated these days because people society is very polarized. People are not willing to invite family members to Thanksgiving just because they have different political views. And I think that's a result of social media. You see that also in academia, that variety of opinions is not appreciated. So some people think of themselves as very open-minded, but they are willing to speak only with people that agree with them. How can that be open-minded? And they want to ban some speakers from coming to campus. So to me, that illustrates a very deep flow. And the way I see it is, if there is someone who thinks differently, we should bring at least one of those people, that community, into the council in order to hear a different view. And it will also serve an important purpose, because if this person, he will be like the canary in a cave, and if this person would agree that with the conclusions that are different from the prior prejudice that person had, then we would know that we have very clear evidence. So it's a very good way to realize that the arguments are solid and robust.
The key is free, open inquiry. That's what I support. I don't support any kind of a stigma or anything like that. Just look into it and tell us what you find. It's very, very important, and I think it is getting lost today. And you're not the only scientist that I know that it's happening to. So
yeah. I should also mention that you may ask, why do I care so much about national security? And the point is that this is an important fuel for us to get more data. If this could be a national security risk, and that is a very good motivation for the government to invest resources in figuring it out. So once we collect a lot of data, there is no way back. Okay, so the only way the scientific community can resist any alternative explanation to UAP, that they might be extraterrestrial in origin, the only way they can resist it is by insisting that they know the answer, and it's a waste of effort to try and check if their assumption is correct. And by not collecting new data, they basically have a confirmation bias. They basically have a self-fulfilling prophecy. Obviously, there is no evidence that contradicts their argument, because they're not willing to explore that evidence. However, if the government explores the evidence just because it's a national security threat and it needs to be figured out, then we will get to the bottom of it. And we will have no way out of the conclusions once there is enough data. So this is a perfect way to get the answer and get the resources that will bring us to the answer.
All right, the next question, Megazino 753. Did 3I Atlas come from the center of the galaxy?
We, together with my student, we integrated the trajectory of 3I Atlas back in time, and it looks like it originated from the thick disk of the Milky Way galaxy, not from the center. The thick disk is made of old stars, and the reason that they occupy a thick disk, not a thin disk, is stars are formed out of gas in the Milky Way galaxy, cold gas in molecular clouds, and that cold gas is in the thin disk. And then once the stars are made, over time, they get scrambled by small galaxies passing through the disk, or globular clusters of stars passing through the disk. They mix up the stars, they puff it up, puff the disk up. So there is a clear correlation between the thickness of the disk and the age of the stars associated with it. And the older stars, of course, had more time to be moved around and kicked around, also by spiral arms and so forth. And so you end up with a thin disk of old stars. Now, this conclusion that 3I Atlas came from old stars, that is not a robust conclusion, because it ignores the possibility that its speed was obtained as a result of the ejection from the parent star. So if it had a large ejection velocity, then the fact that it occupies the thick disk is just an outcome of the large ejection speed that it had. Has nothing to do with the age of the star. So you can have young stars in the thin disk that have a large ejection speed, and then this object 3I Atlas will move up and down a lot. and therefore you would think that it came from the thick disk, but it's actually the ejection speed.
Yeah, past a certain point, you can't trace origins of stuff.
No, you can't tell. You can't tell. But it's definitely not pointing towards the center of the galaxy. I mean,
Right.
we have a paper where we show the trajectory. So it's associated with a torus. The origin point is associated with a torus around the orbit of the sun.
You just can't tell because it's like a game of billiards pool. You can only
You
reconstruct.
can't tell which star it came from because stars change positions, and by the way, there are so many of them that it passes close to many stars, so you never know unless you know the age of the object. If there was a clock on it, or if you, for example, dated it with radioactive material, then of course, if you know the age, then you can tell how far it went,
Right.
because you know the velocity. The velocity is measured, and knowing the age would tell you what was the distance that it went through between birth and detection. And by the way, that's one thing I wanted to do in principle with an interstellar meteor like IM1 that we went for in the Pacific Ocean. If we could date it based on isotopes, then we will know, and we know the velocity, then we will know from where it came.
Hobbit Mouse asks, if you sign an NDA in the future, would you break it to reveal to the world about the existence of non-human intelligent life and their advanced technology?
I think it's too hypothetical, because I do think that if such information exists, it should not be under an NDA, because, as I mentioned, it should be shared. It has nothing to do with national security. It has to be shared by all humans. One day it will be discovered from another data set. And so at the moment, the situation that we are in is that there are objects that are not understood, okay, are not identified. The US government kept some of the data classified because it was collected by classified sensors, because they weren't sure that it's not from adversarial nations, because they didn't want to admit that they're not doing their job, in the Pentagon or the intelligence agencies. For all these reasons, I mean, it makes a lot of sense to keep it under wraps. Now we live in a different time where there is a directive from the US president, President Trump, to share as much as possible without sacrificing national security. So with this in mind, this is a hypothetical question that is not relevant to the present time, because if it has nothing to do with human-made technologies, then obviously it should be shared with the public in accordance with President Trump's directive.
Unless, and this is me speaking, unless there's some aspect to the UAP phenomenon that shows a direct threat, meaning it is national security. I would argue that it's actually global security, because everybody would be under threat.
Yeah, but that's my point. My point is that it's not related to one nation. There is no reason why the aliens would focus on a particular nation, because we just split the earth arbitrarily into nations, and that they don't care about that.
No, they don't. And going from the past, Ronald Reagan made a number of references to
exactly. I completely agree with President Reagan. I should also mention that the reason I'm where I am right now in the US is thanks to President Reagan, because he established the Strategic Defense Initiative that was called Star Wars at the time in the mid-1980s.
Mm-hmm.
And General Abramson, that was appointed as the director of that program, came to visit Israel at the time that I was 20 years old and 21 years old. And I presented to him a project, and that project got funded. It was the first international project to be funded by this program, and it brought me to the US for visits. And in one of the visits, I also visited the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton, where they offered me a 5-year fellowship under the condition that I'll switch to astrophysics. So without President Reagan having Star Wars, I wouldn't be here.
It makes you wonder whatever happened to Star Wars.
Well, now, okay, so at the time, here is an interesting historical lesson. At the time, academia was very much opposed. They ridiculed President Reagan's Star Wars initiative. They said, that's stupid, makes no sense. How can we protect against the missiles, ballistic missiles? There is no way. This is not practical. It makes no sense. Now, at the time, it had a huge political impact. It led to glasnost because the Russians were afraid, in part. That was one. It had a political impact on the Soviet Union. But in retrospect, right now, we have the Golden Dome initiative, which is basically, all technologists and people in academia are saying, yeah, now it's doable. Now we can do it. And so now it's a plan that everyone accepts as realistic to protect against ballistic missiles. In fact, we do have other protections already. And all of this was dreamed about during the Strategic Defense Initiative in the 1980s. And so, 40 years later, this is practical and everyone says it makes a lot of sense. 40 years back, if you go, back in time, to that time, academia was just ridiculing it. What does it tell you? It tells you that even when you listen to so-called self-declared experts, very often they are just very limited in their imagination.
Now, Dr. Loeb, we have a question from X, or Twitter, or whatever they're calling it these days. As you chair the new UAP Science Advisory Council that includes Admiral Gallaudet, with his deep naval oceanography background, he was a director of the NOAA. How is the team approaching the possibility of significant underwater or oceanic UAP USO activity? Recent file releases have included orb-like phenomena with unusual behavior.
Right. So
there's more.
Oh, okay.
What kinds of data would shift the council's assessment towards non-human intelligences that may have had a long-term presence on or near Earth, potentially crypto-terrestrial or interdimensional in nature, rather than solely recent interstellar visitors? How does the council weigh these possibilities against the traditional extraterrestrial hypothesis? That's a very long, loaded group of questions.
No, that's an excellent
we can go through and take it one by one if you like.
Yeah. That's an excellent question, and we will take it seriously. And of course, as everyone knows, the bottom of the ocean was less studied than the surface of the moon. Okay. We just don't know what's going on down there, and I experienced that in the expedition that I took 3 years ago. So the ocean is vast, and we just didn't explore most of it, and it's possible. I mean, that would be a very natural place to hide. It's possible that there is something hiding there that we haven't seen. And not just natural, but technological. And so we should take it seriously, because there are reports of unusual objects moving, under the deep in the ocean. And the fact that we have Dr. Tim Gallaudet on the team is a reflection of the value that we assign to this domain of study, and we would benefit greatly from his knowledge and expertise. But as I said before, it all depends on the data that is shared with us, and we hope that if there is such data, we will see it.
Now, this next question is getting more direct, and it's something that I'm particularly interested in because this gets into DNA testing.
Okay.
Thing in a thing asks, and I'm actually going to go back to that USO question and ask a few more things about that, but I wanted to ask this one first because it's important. Okay. Does the council's materials mandate include biological specimens, or is it limited to non-biological retrieved materials, metals versus alien parts? Is there any sort of a distinction there on what they would let you see? In other words, they say, well, you can see the metal, but you can't see the biologicals. And this is all out there. This is what's being talked about.
Well, this is too early to tell, because we were not, well, first of all, we were not given a mandate. Nobody told us what we should be curious about. And of course, we will be curious about the materials and potentially biological materials if it exists. So there are no limits to what we are curious about. The question is, what does the government really have? And that I don't know. But we will definitely encourage them to share with us if they do have materials from crash sites that might be of great interest. Now, one should remember that some people who suggest that say that those materials were transported to corporations outside government. And already Representative Burleson sent a memo to, or request, a letter to at least two corporations, MITRE, and some people suggest Lockheed Martin has perhaps some materials. I haven't seen evidence that they do, but I heard from people that worked at Lockheed Martin that do not necessarily deny this notion. But again, it's not about storytelling. We have to see the evidence, and I hope that we can get to it because there is a change. I mean, that's one thing I try to communicate, that there is a change right now in the state of mind of government thanks to the directive from President Trump. We want to get to the bottom of this, and that means that people, bureaucrats cannot hide the evidence if it exists, and gatekeepers will have to move to the side. So my hope is that if such evidence, so there is this fundamental question: does the government or corporations have materials? And I hope we will know that.
All right, Dr. Loeb, back to the Twitter question to expand on a certain area. A lot of people, including that question from Twitter, mention interdimensional nature.
Yes.
And there's all kinds of talk about, ultra terrestrials and things like that.
Yes.
Within physics. Now, I have problems physically with the idea of other dimensions, being macro, and why. What is your view on that? Do you think there's for
so I should say this notion of extra dimensions that was inspired by string theory over the past 50 years. The mathematical physicists came up with an approach to unify quantum mechanics and gravity, but they can do that only when they add spatial dimensions, altogether maybe 11 or it really depends on the version of the theory. But the idea is that by adding more spatial dimensions, they can actually potentially unify quantum mechanics and gravity. The problem is we haven't found any clues to such dimensions. And there are experiments that really set limits on the scale of those extra dimensions. It has to be very small because otherwise we would notice it. Just to give you an example, we see the emission of gravitational waves from two black holes colliding at the edge of the universe. Imagine that there were extra dimensions, then some of the energy will go into those dimensions. We're talking about gravitational waves. So these gravitational waves propagate through space-time, through all the spatial dimensions. So we would see some missing energy because we are limited to the 3+1, the three spatial dimensions and the dimension of time. So if there were additional big dimensions, we would immediately notice that there is less energy than we expect in 3+1 dimensions. But we don't see that, very tight limits. We can fit the waveforms that we get from all of the gravitational wave sources very well in 3+1 dimensions. Now, also there are laboratory experiments. You can show that the force of gravity will be modified if there were, even if the extra dimension was curled up on a millimeter scale, you would be able to notice that in laboratory experiments that detect gravity on a millimeter scale. And that's not observed. So we can say, oh, the extra dimension is smaller, is curled on a scale smaller than a millimeter, very small. And then the question, okay, so if all these extra dimensions exist, and we don't know that, by the way, because it's only a speculation on behalf of string theories, but even if you imagine that they exist, they have to be curled up on a tiny scale. And the string theorists will tell you the most likely scale is the Planck scale. So these are really tiny extra dimensions. and there is no physical effect that we would notice as a result of them, because they are curled on tiny scales. So only when you probe that scale, either by using particles with very high energies, or by having a probe on the Planck scale, only then you would notice the extra dimensions. So when you say there is data on a UAP, UFO, we are dealing with very large scales. We're talking about centimeters, meters, very large macroscopic scales. On these scales, there are very tight limits on extra dimensions. Okay. So then people say, oh, maybe the objects came and are multidimensional. These are people that are really speaking very superficially about extra dimensions. They never try to incorporate this idea in the context of a physical theory. So I would say just ignore that. Okay, let's not bring in words that make no sense. Let's not talk about the wormholes or extra dimensions. Let's just talk about the objects, see what the object is doing, and then once we realize the anomalies of the object, we can then try and construct a physical theory for what can explain it. But just saying, oh, this object is weird, therefore there should be extra dimensions, that's very superficial, because physicists were working for decades in laboratory experiments in constraining the extra dimension down to a scale smaller than a millimeter. So now you are telling them, oh, it's on meter scale. No, maybe it's something. Of course, there could be physics beyond the standard model that we have, and most likely there is, because the standard model doesn't include the dark matter, it doesn't include dark energy. So definitely there is physics beyond the standard model. But in order to figure it out, we need high quality scientific data that will guide us. And we shouldn't use words that do not mean much. We should just say, these are the anomalies, and once we nail them, then we will ask everyone to think about possible explanations. But when we have fuzzy data, not conclusive, it's not convincing, you can't really reveal new physics this way. It's very amateurish of people to say, oh, why not? Let's just dream up all kinds of. I mean, obviously, someone like Steven Spielberg has artistic freedom. He can do whatever he wants. You can put it in a movie, but you can't do it in the context of scientific inquiry, like doing physics, discovering new physics. In order to do that, you really need very high quality data, and you need to demonstrate that whatever you're observing does not comply with the known physics in 3 dimensions, 3 spatial dimensions, and therefore there must be something else accounting for it.
Yes, it always seemed more science fiction, the dimensional stuff, than actual physics, because you were right. They have been constraining that down for decades, and it's down to tiny little curled up, almost nothing dimensions, and it's you're probably not going to get civilization out of that.
No, but there could be something exotic that we are not familiar with. For example, we don't know what the dark matter is, so just imagine that the aliens engineered it.
Well, that's where I would go. So let me ask you this before I ask the next audience question. And we're starting to run down the questions, but I figured we should go as long as we could just to make sure that the information is out there. All right, Doctor, can dark matter account for the UAP phenomenon? In other words, if you were to somehow see a manifestation of dark matter visually, I don't know how it would do this, but we don't know what it is, and you interpret that as a UFO or UAP? In other words, you catch a glimpse of it, and the brain does this. The brain has to paint in and construct things, and it sees it as something anomalous within the psychological context of the time. So right now we see orbs. 50 years ago, they see discs. Before that, they see fairies, et cetera, all the way back. And that it's just simply a product of the human brain seeing something it does not understand. Or if you want to go interdimensional, there used to be talk about what a multi-dimensional thing would look like, a tesseract. Carl Sagan famously explained that. So
well, it depends
go with that.
Yeah. So in the case of extra dimensions, it depends how curled the extra dimensions are. If they are curled on tiny scales, you won't see anything unless you are probing those scales. And when you use these cameras that are recording UAPs, you're not probing very tiny scales. You're not probing scales smaller than a millimeter or a micron. But with respect to the other question about the dark matter, the one property of dark matter is that it's invisible. It doesn't interact electromagnetically with light or with matter, and so it will be invisible. So in order for you to see something, it has to interact with light. So it cannot be made just of dark matter. But in terms of propulsion, you could use dark matter. You can use dark energy for propulsion, as long as you can engineer those substances. So, the dark matter makes 84% of the matter in the universe, 84% of the matter. And then the dark energy makes 70% of the mass energy budget of the universe. So, we're dealing with substances that make up most of the mass budget of the universe, but there could be other substances in the universe that make a small fraction of the cosmic mass budget, but are very useful for engineering, and we are not aware of them. And so there might be a lot, it might be just the tip of the iceberg. The dark matter, dark energy is just the tip of the iceberg that we notice because they make a big contribution to the mass budget, the cosmic mass budget. But there are other substances that we haven't even noticed that aliens are taking advantage of or producing. And that includes propulsion technologies, that includes materials, lots of possibilities. What I would suggest is, our imagination is limited by the experiences we had so far, and we just cannot imagine things that go well beyond. The way I say it is, in science, all the funding of science, all the projects that you see are exploring the unknown. So these are things that we know that we don't know. We don't know the nature of dark matter, so we are putting money into figuring it out. So all of science is about studying the unknown. But there is one part which is completely different, and it is the unknown unknowns. These are things that we don't even recognize, that we don't know. So, for example, if there is a substance that is not making a huge contribution to the mass budget of the universe, but can be engineered such that you will derive exceptional propulsion capabilities, then we would not even know that we don't know that. And therefore, the best path is for us to be curious and open-minded, not to assume anything, not to listen to Spielberg. Spielberg has a very limited imagination. I met him a decade ago when he got the honorary degree at Harvard. And he told me, Avi, if you find any evidence for aliens, let me be the first to know about it. So he did show some sense of humility, but basically it reflects the fact that our training data set is limited to experiences we had on Earth. So when we imagine aliens, they look like things we've seen on Earth. They have slightly different eyes. In his film, they have slightly different bodies, but they still have 2 arms, 2 legs, they have eyes. So what we imagine resembles what we already experienced on Earth. But, reality is under no obligation to agree with us, to make us happy. And the training data set of the universe is huge compared to what we find on Earth. That's why meeting aliens, alien intelligence would be far more revolutionary for us than artificial intelligence, which, we are investing $700 billion in data centers, but all these data centers, $700 billion this year for all these data centers is just data from this Earth. And, there are billions of Earth-Sun analogs in the Milky Way galaxy alone, and 1 trillion galaxies in the observable volume of the universe. Just think how many data centers you need in order to describe those data sets. And if we meet alien intelligence, it may have been trained on these bigger data sets. So for us, it would be a learning experience. We just the axis of time, you think we had only 100 years since the discovery of quantum mechanics. Think about where we will be in 1,000 years after quantum mechanics was discovered, or in 1,000,000 years or 1,000,000,000 years. If they are representing our future, it will be unrecognizable for us. The experience will be more puzzling than a cave dweller finding a cell phone. And obviously, a cave dweller finding a cell phone would say it's a rock of a type that they've never seen before. And when we see those things that we cannot imagine of our future technologies, obviously astronomers would say, oh, it's just an iceberg, or it's just a rock. But that they will be no different than the cave dweller seeing a cell phone.
Those are things like cultures that develop, but I'm just looking for the adventure of what exploring this is going to be. Walkerdale 6602, and this is one of our last couple questions here, says, thank you for answering questions. Just wondering if you have met with David Grush, and if so, what was your impression of him?
I actually had a Zoom call with him, and I felt that he's very honest. He truly believes what he says. And that's very intriguing. If he's correct, then we have a learning curve, to figure out where these visitors came from, and we are heading towards a very different future than our past. But I haven't seen the actual evidence, so that's where I just cannot say that the story that he tells is beyond a reasonable doubt. I cannot say that because I haven't seen the evidence. But he's a serious person, and he truly believes what he says. But we need to see the evidence. Where is the beef? And we need to find that evidence, and only then, everyone will be convinced. So it's really important that he's part of the disclosure effort, because if he can point us in the right direction, and then we find that evidence, then we will know more.
Thoughts on 0-point energy, and could it directly reflect something regarding the UAP phenomenon, if indeed there's something really anomalous here?
That's very interesting. By the way, John, we are not, your camera stopped working. Yeah, the 0-point energy is basically the energy of the vacuum. That's if you remove all matter, then you are left with the vacuum energy density. And we know that the vacuum is not completely empty, because the universe is not only expanding, but its expansion is accelerating. So this is the so-called cosmological constant that Einstein thought about early on, because he wanted to balance the attractive gravity produced by matter with a repulsive gravity of the vacuum. And he was wrong. The universe is expanding. But even though he was wrong, there is still a there is still a vacuum energy density filling up the universe that is triggering the accelerated expansion right now. And so that's the 0-point energy in our region of space-time. The value of the vacuum energy may be different outside of our cosmic horizon, but we have no access to that. So in our cosmic horizon, there seem to be some 0-point energy. Now, can we tap into that? Can we use it? Now, there are effects in physics well known, like, for example, the Casimir effect, where if you take two conducting plates, you're basically limiting. I mean, the vacuum is active in quantum mechanics. There are virtual particles produced and destroyed all the time in the vacuum. So if you put two plates, there are electromagnetic fluctuations, but they are constrained because the conducting plates imply that the electric field on the plate is zero. If they are perfectly conducting, the electric field must be zero. So when you put the two plates side to side, then it means that the fluctuations in the electromagnetic field between them are constrained. And so there is a force that attracts the two plates, because there is less energy density in between the plates for the vacuum than outside. So you have some pressure. But you can show that this use of the vacuum fluctuations is a small fraction of the energy density or the mass density of the plates themselves. So you can't really build a system that has, like negative energy density out of that, because even though you reduce the energy density of the vacuum, you actually, in order to do that, you need to put much more mass and energy in the plates. So now the reason I bring this up is if we had a way of producing an object with a negative mass, then it would be a great accomplishment. Because imagine, just look at Starship, this rocket that Elon Musk is building. It has a huge fuel reservoir the size of a football field, and the payload is tiny at the top. Now imagine if we could accompany the payload, which has a positive mass, with just a component that has negative mass of equal value, then the total mass of the system would be zero, because the negative mass will cancel out the positive mass of the payload. This would mean that the payload and the negative mass together, that system, would just float. It would not respond to the Earth's gravity because it has zero mass, zero coupling to gravity. An object with zero mass means that, it means that it's not bound by gravity. So that system, you can have a kid at Cape Canaveral, just a baby, giving a kick to Starship, and it will escape from the Earth. Just a baby will give it a kick because it's floating. Gravity is not acting on it. So if you have access to negative mass, if you can engineer it, you can have propulsion without fuel. And the question of whether we can manipulate the vacuum to create negative mass objects is still open. If we had such an ability, we could have also built a time machine. You can easily prove that. So, we don't have a time machine. I can guarantee to you that no Jewish physicist in our future had access to a time machine. How do I know that? Because if I had access to a time machine, I would go back in time and kill baby Hitler, because that would prevent the Holocaust. I mean, 65 members of my father's family died because of Hitler. So the fact that our history books show the Holocaust means that no Jewish scientist will have access to a time machine in the future.
It's also how the United States got people like Hans Bethe and Albert.
That's true.
All right, Dr. Loeb, we have one last final question. Super Crazy Movie Geek 7409 asks, Dr. Loeb, if it is openly confirmed that there has been an 80-year UFO government cover-up that was hiding ETs and their spaceships, how would you feel about that? And I'm going to add something. At any point in your exploration of the UAP phenomenon, do you think that anyone from the government has lied to you?
Not to me, no. I had very good interactions with the government so far, but it's possible. It's possible, especially if materials were delivered to corporations that are outside government. Those are under no obligation to answer questions like FOIA from the public. It's possible, definitely. And the question is, do you blame the government bureaucracy, or do you blame the corporations, or who do you blame? Now, frankly, my point is, let's not do the blaming game. Let's just figure things out. Like this will be such a discovery that will shape the future of humanity in such a profound way that we should, just focus on the future, not on the past. Obviously, people did very bad things in the past. I just mentioned the Holocaust. This pales in comparison. The point is, if you keep having a grudge about what happened in the past, you are wasting your time, especially when there is a discovery of this magnitude to be made. It will have such a profound impact on our future. We should just think about that and not the blame game. What pleasure do we get out of blaming bureaucrats? What would be the benefit of putting them in town centers or on Twitter and denigrating them or tarnishing their reputation? I mean, what's the point here? Why should we get pleasure out of blaming people? The point is that let's get the truth out, and whoever is willing to help us will be part of the celebration. Once we discover that, then we have to think about what to do next. How will it shape our future? And how can we make a future that is better than the past? And one way that I can see is, we're investing $2.4 trillion a year on military budgets worldwide. this is just to kill other people or prevent other people from killing us. But if we realize that, someone is knocking on our door, there is some other entity, then this will change the conversation. The priority is we will have to defend all of humanity in case the visitor is hostile. We will have to work together in order to visit the birthplace of the visitor. The visitor is visiting us in our backyard. We want to visit their backyard. We want to learn more. So there is so much room for cooperation, collaboration, that I think it will change everything. And for us to stay in this mindset of, okay, who should we blame? Who should we hang? Who should we torture because of the past? Is really, we're really missing the opportunity to be better.
Dr. Loeb, thank you, and it was a pleasure being here myself because I'm off my normal channels. It's like being in space, like being on Mars, and I really truly wish you. Actually, we all do. From this conversation, we really wish we await what you find with open minds.
Thanks for having me, and the best is yet to come. Just stay curious. That's all we need. And remove all toxicity from social media because we might have a bright future ahead.
We shall see.